got the gearbox up on the table, and just started to clean some of the worst of the filth out of it. And then I'm going to break it down into pieces, take the selector off, get ready to undo the rear coupling if I can, and then clean it up properly. Going to try and get the rear drive flange off with just an impact gun. Not sure this is going to work or not. In the past I've had to like bolt stuff to the flange, stop it rotating, and then use a big lever bar and some scaffold poles. Yeah, it's just going to spin over. Right, I'm going to have to go and get something to wedge that. Okay, I got lucky. It came off with me just holding that and then going at it with the gun. And that's the rear flange off. Hopefully not too much oil is going to come out. And that went in there, keep that safe. But that will allow me to replace that seal, and also I want to split the box here so I can change the O-ring on the selector as well. I've just started draining the oil. You can see the amount of metal shavings stuck to that magnet, and the colour of the oil doesn't look great either. It's not too scary because there's always some shrapnel in the gearboxes because they are metal parts wearing against each other. But yeah, the proof will be in the opening it up and driving the thing. When it's in the car, it all selects fine, and I know it was getting gears because I could drive it around the car parking first. So hopefully a bit of a clean up internally and a flush will be all that it needs. That's all the oil out. We've got about, I don't know, 2 litres maybe, if I'm lucky. It's just over 2 of these tubs full. I noticed that actually the oil's not a bad colour once you've got rid of the sediment at the bottom. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was. So now I'm just going to take the bell housing off, take the selector off, and clean up around that join ready for separating the rear cover. It's worth pointing out now something that Mart pointed out in my previous video comments. There's actually a spacer in here between the selector and the support bush and the casting, which there isn't on this side, which twists the whole selector this way. So it would have been quite easy to miss that and not put it back in. I've taken these apart before and never even noticed that, but they've always been very, very well molested and bodged up cars. So it's nice that that's still there because it just means that the rest of it's all original. And yeah, good spot by Mart, so I'll be making sure I remember to put that back in. Just cracked these off. You can see here, that's the washer, top hat bush, and then the 2 spacer washers there. This side, you just had the bolt, the washer, and the 2 rubber top hat bush things. So yeah, they're the 2 spacers. Okay, selector is off. That is the rod that goes in and out of the gearbox that you actually use to change gear. And the O-ring is inside here, and that's the one that appears to have been leaking, as well as probably that rear main seal. The selector itself, this is it upside down, and you've got this rod which translates the movement from the gear selector in the car through there, down this rod, and then into the gearbox via that. And this is the one where it has 2 real thin wall bushes. You can see the play in there. Well, I can, you may not be able to see it on here, but yeah, basically I need to replace that bushing in there and the other one in there so that I get a nice crisp gear selection. I've got the speedo sensor out. The lower bracket goes between the box and the exhaust off, and then also just taking the bell housing off. Going to give this all a bit of a clean down before I try and separate the 2 halves of the box. That's a bit better. I think that holds 5th gear, or it holds something and it needs to come off. Then it's just a case of cracking these ones off and that should come out. So I'm going to try and do that next. I'm going to bolt the bell housing back on, which is over here and all being cleaned up, and that will just give it something to balance on while I'm pulling the rear of the case off. So that's the gearbox on end, back on its bell housing, just a couple of bolts to hold it on and make sure that the input shaft isn't buried into the table. Then this is that thing which I can't remember what it does. It holds a shaft, but I remember that you can't get the tail cover off unless you take that out first. And then what I'm going to try and do, I've undone all these, is just crack it off that gasket here. I don't want to separate that one because I don't want to have to replace 2 paper gaskets. So I'm going to go get a hammer and just tap that up gently and see if it will release. Success! It's freed off at that gasket, which means, ta-da, I can lift that off. And now you can see the O-ring that I want to get to, which is back in there, and that seals on here. That wasn't looking so clever. Looking at the rest of the gearbox, actually looks quite nice. Nothing obviously wrong. Bit of cleaning on there. Yeah. So I shall probably leave it there for tonight. I'll drop that back over just to make sure it's protected, and then when my bits and pieces arrive I can put it all back together. So that's the cover loosened, and if you look inside we just need to undo that square bolt thing, that clamp, and then that cast end will slide off the rod and the whole rod can be withdrawn that way. Before I do it, I'm just going to clean off the grease and mark the position of that casting on the rod so that I can get it back in exactly the same place. Okay, so that was really tight. There was an 11mm spanner in the end to get that off. Even with that screw undone, there's still quite a lot of resistance there, so I'm just going to get a hammer and a chisel and just tap that forward. You can just see the little scrape mark I've made to relocate those bits later. Had a fail which turned out to be a win. Basically I was trying to tap the casting off, it wasn't coming off, and it's because I hadn't undone the grub screw all the way. I just slackened it, and the grub screw actually locates in a deep hole, so there's absolutely no need to mark the position because that defines where it's going to go. So fail, but good for me because now I don't have to be so worried about the relationship between all of these parts. So that's the pin, and that will almost certainly be worn. But the bits that I want to replace and can replace are the little bushings that go in those. So yeah, drive them out. These are the 2 little bushes. They're real thin-walled, steel-backed with a kind of, I don't know whether it's solid lubricant or a bit of phosphor or something on there, but they just sit in those housings. So I've driven them out with that pin and a hammer. You can see on this one particularly the wear to the sides, so it's really thin on one of the side walls compared to the other. If you look at the bottom right now, that bit, this one's not so bad, it's just a bit deformed where I hammered it out, but again there's some thinning to this bit here and it's nice thick on that side. So yeah, due for replacement, and basically you can't really do a lot with this pin unless you were to find a piece of bar that was exactly the right diameter, but at least you can change these. They're like a few pence each, and then at least you've got rid of some of the slack. So by the time those are replaced and all the little bushings that go between the selector and the box itself, you should end up with quite a nice gear change. I'm still waiting on parts to arrive, so apart from cleaning things, I'm relegated to tidying up and going home, really. Never mind. Can't remember, again, where I got up to with my videos. It's Saturday, I'm at my dad's and I've brought home some of the bits back to his garage because that's where I had some of my tools and spare bits and pieces. These are the new replacement bushes for the selector shaft, which go in the underside of the selector here and here. They are just real thin wall steel, and then they have some kind of self-lubricating coating on the inside. And if you're looking to get some yourself, I just ordered them off a bearing supplier. I can't remember now which one it was, but I'll just take some measurements quickly if I can get my thing working. Okay, batteries must have gone on this. I'll have a measure up and I'll describe what size they are so you can see. On another verniers, but the battery's gone on that one too. But just doing it manual, they are about 1mm wall thickness. They are 10mm length. That's not super critical because you can slide it forwards and backwards in the housing. And then outer diameter is 16. So that's what you want, 10 by 16 by 1mm wall thickness. Just cleaned up the selector a bit with petrol just to get the worst of the grease out. These are dead simple to fit. I wouldn't ordinarily use a geology hammer, but I couldn't find my other hammers. I think I must have taken them to my workplace. Just gradually tap it in. Don't do big taps or you'll bruise the edge like that. So now it's seated, I might go and get something a bit softer just to tap it down so I don't completely ruin it. Yeah, I'll go and find a proper drift, I think. Well, I couldn't find an appropriate drift, so I just used the back end of another ratchet. So proper tool abuse going on here, but you can see we have a nicely installed bush, no flattening off. I'll shove that one in, then I'll put the selector rod back in and see what it feels like. Okay, shaft is in, and there is next to no play in that now whatsoever. You do actually get a little bit of play in these ball joint things on the end, but the actual shaft slides really nicely and there's no left to right play, and that's really probably what you're going to feel more than anything. So I can put my mounting back on, the cover, grease it up, put my other union end on, and yeah, ready to go in the car. I've just greased that up and put the cover back on, so that's ready to go. Now I'm turning my attention to the rear gearbox cover. That is my new O-ring, which I need to install in there after I get that one out. That is all that seals that output rod. Well, it's not an output rod, whatever it is the selector connects to actually change the gears. On later gearboxes, they actually machined this out and had a proper lip seal in here as well, and they don't leak, they're much better. I think that's suffix E onwards. This is a suffix D, and I think Rover only went up to suffix D, so all SD1s are going to have this sort of design, so which is why these O-rings are important. It's really dumb that you actually need to take the gearbox half apart in order to get that. It's such a stupid design, but I guess that's why they changed it. Again, rough measurements of the O-ring should you need to get one yourself. This is going to be very, very rough. It looks to be, what's that, 20mm, and then about 2 maybe. You could always just measure the diameter of the housing, which is 16. You can't measure the actual inner diameter there, but you can measure the diameter of the shaft on the gearbox. I don't actually have a gearbox here to measure, but you get the general idea. So I'm going to try and pick that old O-ring out and put the new one in. Right, I've picked it out, and straight away you can see the old one on the left, new one on the right. The new one, it's not a genuine Rover part, it's just a generic ring that I was supplied with, but you can see it's much chubbier, so it should seal a lot better as well. So not only is the rubber going to be more pliable and new and offer a better seal, but it's actually dimensionally larger. So yeah, going to shove this one in and clean up the rear cover, clean off that gasket face, ready to put it back together on the car. The other thing with these boxes is that is the actual oil pump for the gearbox, I think. So the gears quite often can, I think they're plastic and they wear out, so I'm going to open that up as well and have a look inside. And that's the pickup tube. You've got to be careful when you put the gearbox back together that you get that in the right place. I've seen these crushed and flattened off. I don't know whether it's a fault with the box or just a different design, but yeah. So that's the oil pump for the gearbox, just a real crude design. Those are the plastic gears, and those are what can either chip, break down, or just not work anymore. And you can also get some really deep scoring to that alley cover there, so it just loses efficiency. This doesn't look so bad. There's no damage to those teeth. You can swap it for steel parts, I think, but then you're more likely to just chew through your aluminium housing, so I'm just going to keep the plastic ones. This is the reason that you can't tow SD1s, because if you tow it, the rear of the gearbox, the output shaft and everything will be rotating with the axle and spinning the inside of the gearbox over, but the pump is driven off the input shaft side, I think. So basically you could be dragging the car along and the rear end of the gearbox will be rotating, but there won't be any oil circulating and you can knacker your gearbox. So yeah, worth knowing. So I'm just going to clean all this up, clean that gasket off, ready for putting it all back together again on the car. I think I say that a lot, putting it back together, and it's just because it's been quite a lot to do with this. One thing leads to another before you actually get to that point. I'd do a bit of a comparison video between conditions of pumps and things. So that's the back face of this one, and yes, you can see some scoring here, but on this side it's actually pretty good. It's still got the machined surface of the alley. Now if you compare that with this one, can you see there's scoring, concentric scoring all the way around on the housing? It looks pretty gnarly. And then in terms of pump gears, that's my one. This is a bollocks one. You see the shape of the teeth? They're very, very sharp pointed and really, really nasty looking. These ones are still have the flat crests to the top of the teeth and a nice gentle U shape. Those are all sharp and jagged and nasty looking. And it's the same with the teeth on the little driven gear. These ones are completely wrecked, whereas that one, nice and sharp and pointy. The slight mottling and colour difference you can see on this one is just the plastic, it's not actually the shape of the gears. There's a bit of wear on there, but it's nowhere near as bad as the other one. So I'm going to put these parts back in rather than change it. The only weird thing between the two is this one has the flattened off slotted pickup tube, and it has, you know, that profile is deliberate, it's not accidental, whereas my one has a nice round tube. So what the difference is, why they did it, I don't know. This one's the later one, so I'm assuming that's the better one, but I don't actually know, to be honest. I'm just going to put the parts back in that came out of it, because I know they're from a later one and they've only done 40-odd thousand miles. I'm back at work. That's my new gasket, which I've already managed to get oil on somehow. Need to clean the old one off, and then I can reunite that bit with this bit, refit the selector, fit a new seal in that, and get ready to put it back together. Cleaned up that flange and degreased it with some panel white left over from when I was painting it. I've been using this copper silicon. It's actually for bits of engine castings that get hot, but it's still good with oil. I really wanted my Loctite black, but I couldn't find it. So I've just put a tiny bead of that on and then smoothed it out flat with a razor blade. Then I'm going to put the gasket on over the top, do the same to the top surface of this. Then my nice degreased alley housing can go on, and I'll torque it down. I decided it was neater to actually just put the sealer on that cover and leave the gasket plain, because that's obviously wider. I've greased up the selector shaft thing where it's going to go through the new O-ring, because I don't want to risk damaging that. This should just slide on, but in the back here, down that hole, is the speedo drive cog and another sort of spacer thing. You can just see it's moving in a funny direction now. So when this goes over, that has to be poked to make sure that it's actually in the right place, because otherwise you'll mash it with the end of that stud. So this is going to be a two-handed operation, but going to align the end of the oil pump pickup tube with that plastic thing there, make sure that's right, and then just gently lower this down and make sure everything's aligned before I actually try and push it or bolt it home. I've dropped that on. It wasn't as straightforward as I thought it was. I had to constantly turn this output shaft and the input shaft there as well to try and get the little square drive for the oil pump to align up with that bottom shaft. So I was just lifting up and wiggling and rattling stuff until eventually it just sort of dropped on. It still hasn't gone all the way home because there's some dowels there. So hopefully when I start torquing these up, it'll be okay. I found something online that says that it should be, or those covers should be done up to 28 Newton meters. So I'm just going to go around progressively tightening them up. If I notice any resistance, then I'm going to stop. The other thing is that the rear bearing here actually moved outwards while I was doing it and pushing this cover on. So it's obviously quite tight on that shaft in the centre. So I'll have to drive that back in before I can get my new seal in. Rear cover is on and torqued down. I've also fitted the selector thing, jig, and the little bracket that holds that gear thing. I'm hoping you're enjoying my terminology here, because some of these things I don't really know what they are or what they do. One other thing, as I was saying, that bearing had moved out slightly when I was putting the case together, and it needs to be recessed deep enough for you to put your new seal in. And also the output flange gets done up to 205 Newton meters, which I think pushes that down on. I think that actually contacts that bit of the bearing down there, so you don't want to be crushing this in when you torque it up. You want that bearing somewhere properly seated. So I just tapped it down with a drift, making sure I was going around and not just hitting the outer race or just hitting the inner, but sort of alternating between the load of them to get it in nice and square. Next thing is to fit that seal. I think earlier on in the video I was saying that these LT77 gearboxes were fitted to all of the manual SD1s, but there was some variation in the part numbers. Diesels like this have a different fifth gear. Vitesse gearboxes have different bearings and different gears again. This one, I don't know whether you can see, is a suffix D, which means it's the latest type fitted to the SD1. And because of that, it has a much bigger shaft and you need a different size seal. So I think A, B and C suffix gearboxes all have a smaller seal. D has a bigger one. So if you're ordering a rear seal for here, make sure you get the right suffix. I'm just pouring a bit of ATF onto this bearing, because this is the one that I washed out with petrol when I was cleaning up the rear cover, and I don't want that to get ruined. And it will also act as a bit of a lubricant when I fit the new seal. Just make sure that the lip of that seal has also got a bit on it. It's a good thing or a bad thing, but I didn't even need to tap that seal in. I was able to just push it in with my fingers, trying not to damage the seal obviously. So now I can put my flange on. I'll put a bit of ATF on that as well, just to lubricate the seal. A bit of a wiggle. Oh, there we go. Not forgetting the washer and the big nut. It's a nylock, so you should be able to use it again. Also, it's done up really chuffing tight, so I don't anticipate any problems by reusing that one. What I do anticipate problems with is holding this while I put a torque wrench on that and do that up. So to do the final tightening, I'll have to do it when it's back in the car. I do have a piece of bar made up with holes the right size to just grip that, but I can't find what I've done with it. I might have chopped it up and used it for something else. But anyway, that's the rear end done. Now I'm gonna, after I've wound that up a little bit, put it back down the right way up and do up the bell housing bolts properly. I'm always trying to do these videos showing the warts and all of everything, and like easy ways you can screw it up, because it's only when you're doing stuff like this you kind of notice what can and can't go wrong. I very nearly put the bell housing back on, missing one of the dowels, because there should be a dowel there and one at the bottom right, and basically I had all of this on and torqued up and bolted down, and then I found a dowel left over and I was wondering where that was meant to have gone, and so I'm glad I realised, because otherwise the bell housing in theory could be like trying to rotate on here, which would not be good. So basically you have a dowel top left and bottom right, and on those ones you have the longer bolts with the big washers, which is those two, and then the other four just to make up the numbers really. Incidentally, those get done up to 59 foot-pounds, which is about 80 Newton meters. Time to mount the selector. These are the new Super Pro poly bushes to replace the old crappy just standard rubber ones. It's a bit of a fiddle, but you have to wiggle the selector on so that the ball joint goes over that rod, and then once you've got that, then you can start putting the pulley bushes and arranging all the spacers and the bolts, getting them in the right place, same as you took them apart. Remembering that there's additional space at that side to cock it all over, as Mark pointed out last time. That's all back together now. Selector is on, nice and stiff. All turns over okay. I haven't tried selecting gears yet, but I will do that before I actually put it in the box. In the car. Mounting on, I've got the little mount for the exhaust on as well. The speedo sensor is in with its little spacer thing. Bell housing bolted up. Really all I need now is to bolt the flywheel back onto the car, fit the clutch, put the release bearing and the fork and everything in here, greased up, then put it back in the car. Oh, and torque up the output shaft.